Hello, and welcome to the Oxford Wine and Spirits podcast. My name's Tom Brady, and I'm coming to you today from the OWC shop on the Botley Road. We're into March 2024, and after the wettest February on record, the sun is finally shining, which has put me in a really good mood. And it got me to thinking, we've released 2 episodes of this podcast so far, and it's about time that we started looking at the wonderful world of wine. So let's do just that. My guest today, Lee Isaacs, is one of the most articulate people I know when it comes to discussing the industry that we work in. So I thought, let's do an episode with Lee titled, What It's Really Like to Work in the Wine Industry. I really enjoyed recording this one, so let's dive straight in. Lee Isaacs, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start our conversation off today with a little game. The theme of today's podcast is what it's really like to work in the wine industry. So the rules are, I'm going to make a blanket statement about something in the wine industry, and you're allowed to answer with agree or disagree. Or if you're really stuck, it's complicated.
Fire away.
So I'm going to apologize for any Black Books references. Number 1, the older the wine is, the gooder it is.
This is complicated.
Number 2, the more expensive the wine is, the gooder it is.
Agree.
Number 3, if you spend more than £20 on a bottle of wine, you're paying for the marketing.
Disagree on the figure, not necessarily the principle.
Okay, we'll maybe get back into that one a little bit later. Number 4, wine sealed with a cork are better quality than wine sealed with a screw cap.
Disagree.
Number 5, wines made with no added sulfur won't give you a hangover.
Disagree enormously, massively, vehemently disagree.
Number 6. Number 6. When you swirl wine in the glass, the legs or tears that run down the inside of said glass have a bearing on the quality of the wine.
I mean, obviously, I agree with that. No, I disagree with that.
Number 7. Red wine is best served at room temperature.
Disagree.
Number 8. The second cheapest bottle on a restaurant wine list usually has the biggest markup.
Ooh, broadly agree.
Number 9, you should never drink red wine with fish.
Disagree.
And number 10, you should never, ever drink Chardonnay.
Ooh, I mean, there's history there, isn't there? But I'll disagree.
Very good, very good. So I'm going to give you a chance to clarify these points later on. But Lee, we've known each other for a few years now, and I know you spent several years at the Oxford Wine Company while I was still plying my trade in the hospitality sector. I was wondering, though, if you could give us a quick bio for all those listening at home about your career to date and the kinds of things you do in this crazy industry that we work in together.
I've been around wine since about the age of 5, so I was encouraged to sort of taste a little bit of white wine, and that was topped up with water or lemonade. And those ratios changed the more drunk the older I became. And I just became fascinated by it. Now, obviously, I'm sort of based in Oxfordshire and I work in wine, and there's certain assumptions that you might make around that people often do. I'm from a northern working class family where we did drink wine, but the wines we drank were very ordinary, very everyday wines. I didn't know what claret was. We didn't have Burgundy. I didn't know what Barolo was until I joined the wine industry, for example. So the wines I grew up drinking were really ordinary, accessible, everyday wines, but they were just fascinating to me. And I started to realise that different wines tasted differently. And there was an event that took place when I was 13. I was in a hotel in London. Remember, I grew up working class in the north. So back then, to get from the northwest to London took like 6 months. So I'm in this hotel in London. I'm 13. And I didn't realise the importance of the event at the time. But we're in this hotel bar, and my mother ordered a glass of house red, and it will surprise your listeners to know that I was a very precocious 13-year-old. I'd seen Oz Clarke and Gilly Goulden on the television, and I took the glass and I did a really big dramatic swirl and sniff, and I said, raspberries and cherries and spice and whatever. And then I, sipped some of this wine, and I did the slurpy noises. My mother was dying of shame in the corner, but I pronounced the hotel bar. I said, I think this is an Australian Shiraz, and my mother said, "You're 13. Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." But it was an Australian Shiraz. Now, at 13, I didn't know anything about wine at all. I was 13. But I knew there was a grape called Shiraz. Didn't know why, but I knew there were others. And I knew it wasn't just the Australians made wine. And I thought, That's fascinating that by looking, smelling, tasting, senses that most of us have, I could identify something so specific. I thought that was wondrous. I was like, how does this work? How does that happen? Fast forward to me turning 18, I was accepted to university, but I took a year out, and this was 2002, and I got a job in my local op bins. Big shout out to the op bins, massive, sadly now completely gone, which is a great shame. But I got a job in my local op bins in Kendal, where I'm from, and 3 months in, I was hooked. I phoned the university, said, thanks for offering me a place, but I won't be coming. And I've been in the industry ever since. So my background really is independent wine retail and education. So I worked for Oddbins for years. I moved to Oxford in 2010, or Oxfordshire, I should say, really, where I joined the Oxford Wine Company. And I ran the Botley Road shop for 5 years and did various bits and pieces in the business. Whilst I was there, and I'm internally grateful to the Oxford Wine Company for this. The company sponsored me through my WSET diploma, which I'd always aspired to do, but had never been able to afford it. And I passed that. I then went on, when I left the Oxford Wine Company, I became head of education for what was then the oldest wine school in Oxford, which led to me teaching and lecturing all over the world, which is a really crazy thing to think about. I've been all over the world teaching and training and lecturing. I have been described as one of the UK's leading experts in the wines and country of Argentina. So I've been going to Argentina since 2012. I go most years, so it's a country I'm heavily invested in. I've travelled widely around Italy. And today I do all sorts of different things. So I sort of describe myself as an educator, a communicator, and an entertainer, which always sounds a little bit conceited when you describe yourself as such. But I mainly teach and lecture. So I teach at the WSET school in London. I lecture at Regent's University, also in London, and I teach and lecture wherever there is a need for that, and I can get along. I'm a wine judge, so I'm a panel chair actually for the Independent English Wine Awards, which is something I feel very privileged to do. I do lots and lots of consumer-focused events, and that could be for wine groups, wine clubs, corporate entertainment, weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, anywhere where somebody says, we want somebody to come along and talk about wine. I have an ambassadorial role, so I work with a small-scale, boutique-focused Spanish wine importer. I write, I do bits to camera, I do social media, comms, wine stand-up comedy, anything that involves speaking to people about wine. I could have summed all that up. I've probably taken about 40 minutes to go, I talk about wine, basically.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, right? It's a fascinating subject.
It's a never-ending. So not only is it fascinating, it's never-ending, especially the way I talk about it.
So I suppose I should ask, I mean, does it ever get boring? What keeps you coming back?
It's what you said there. It's never boring. I mean, this thing, to me, that the product and the industry is magical. It's mysterious. It's filled with the most incredible people. The product is obviously, we love it. That's the starting point. Nobody goes, oh, I like a wine industry and then gets into wine. You get into wine first. But it's the experiences, the things I've done and the places I've seen and the people I've, drunk with and dined with and talked to, all because there's a fruit that ultimately grows out the ground. And we figured out that we can kind of change the sugar into alcohol, and the compounds in the grape we can release them from and turn them into flavour. It's fascinating, genuinely fascinating to me that we kind of go through the process of tasting. Obviously, I teach on this a lot about, how you start figuring it out, and you look at the grape and you look at the wine in the glass, and certain things give you indicators, the level of colour and all this. And then you smell it, and certain smells take you to certain places, and then you taste it, and the way it feels gives you lots of... That is genuinely mind-blowing to me to this day. It's like alchemy, that I could look and smell and taste something and be able to tell you exactly what... Well, I couldn't. I'm not a very good blind taster, but if you know what you're doing, that you could do that. It absolutely blows my mind. I think it's incredible. What a thing to be able to experience.
I mean, what a great answer. I mean, I always say one of the most fascinating things about the wine industry is this idea that I believe you could do a 3-year university degree that covers every single possible core subject that you could think of, and it could all be wine related. There's obviously science involved in it, biology, but there's also so much history. There's business, economics, everything you could possibly, literature, poetry, mathematics, all of these things. And you could link it back to wine. And to have a real kind of grasp on the industry of wine, you kind of need to have a finger in every single one of those pies. Otherwise, you're going to miss something. And that to me is completely fascinating.
Any subject you can think of, it applies to wine. You meant history, meteorology, climatology, just everything can be found in wine in some way, and it can be the humanities or it can be the sciences. So as a result of that, something we might touch on later, there's actually a lot of ways of getting into wine that we don't necessarily think about. People can go off and study certain things, and those skills and that knowledge would be really useful in wine, but there's no obvious connection.
And of course, with a subject that is so complex, there is obviously a lot of miscommunication. There's a lot of legend and a lot of myth. And the next thing I'd like to ask you really is what you feel is the biggest myth in the wine industry.
I think the biggest myth from a consumer point of view is that working in the wine industry it's all fancy dinners, foreign travel, and expensive bottles, and that couldn't be further from the truth. There's a lot of sort of stuff and nonsense spoken to the point where I think consumers see that working in wine is probably quite easy, it's probably fancy, and it's probably well paid. It's none of those things if you do it properly. I think the other biggest myth is that we do it for the alcohol. We have this thing about alcohol, don't we? And it's not just in the UK, but there's almost like a sense of pride in waking up with a hangover, right? That's not a good thing. Waking up with a hangover is awful. You lose an hour, a couple of, you might lose an entire day. You must spend your time drunk. I've got way too much to do to get drunk. And actually, I drink very little wine. Or drink very little anything. I would drink more than the average, I'm quite sure. But, I don't spend my time sitting down with fancy meals, drinking wine, because there's just too much to do. It's a busy industry. It's a hectic industry. We spend a lot of our time kind of on the road trying to get to somewhere. We spend a lot of our time with our head in butt or learning or, watching videos because, you're constantly trying to take in new information. You're constantly trying to find ways of communicating that back out. That you can't just walk into it. And it's the fact that it is so complex and there's always something to know. You can't rest on your laurels and you can't just assume stuff to be true. So as an example, I've mentioned Argentina. I spend a lot of my time talking about Argentina for, presentations to wine clubs, wine groups, and so on and so forth. So I know the subject quite well, it's fair to say, but I can't just turn up to an Argentine tasting and sort of go, well, everything that I said last month is still correct because things change so quickly. So you're constantly trying to keep on top of it.
And at the same time, though, this could be seen as probably a weakness in the wine industry, because I think for someone who has spent probably the majority of my adult life kind of looking at wine professionals from the outside in with a little knowledge of wine, the barriers to entry there are huge. There's so many different aspects to it that we've already discussed. And it's so hard to actually kind of form anything coherent in terms of talking about wine, which I think is, if you're somebody who's genuinely interested and wants to get into it, is probably a bit negative, really, because it's quite fear-inducing from the outside, right?
It definitely can be. When I started doing this, I had to open a book and get my head in it and maybe catch something on terrestrial TV that was on at a certain time that I couldn't catch up with. So if I was watching Food and Drink or a wine program, today you've got YouTube, you've got podcasts, social media, Instagram and Twitter. There's wine information pouring out of these mediums. Where you have to be careful is if you're, say, following it on social media, because not everybody gets things right. Everybody makes mistakes, even the most seasoned wine professionals. But I see some content, I see some of these people who have huge followings saying things that aren't correct. And you go, that's a problem. Okay, because someone's going to take that, they're going to trust it, and they're going to go in completely the wrong direction. And certainly if the person that is accessing that information is wanting to use it to sort of start to build a wine career, they're really not getting off on the right foot. Now, as I say, we all make mistakes, but some of the errors are pretty glaring. So if you're trying to get into it, follow something that's kind of ratified and certified, and then build around that. So obviously I teach WSET, so that's the people I would talk about. I did my own studies through WSET. That's pretty solid and reliable. So get a base information from there, then build out and interact. There's one of the great things about the industry, and I say it all the times, the people are incredible in this industry. They're friendly, they're kind, they're smart, they're funny. I've not met many wine professionals who did not have some time to answer a question or explain something.
I think you've got to be really, really humble as well when you're getting into something. I think the biggest mistake you can do if you want to get into wine and you want to develop that knowledge is just be arrogant and just something that you've read but not really quite understood, take it as read and then start spouting it off as your own. I think that's a real problem. We all meet these people. I mean, having worked in wine retail, you get a lot of people coming in who are important that they're seen to know what they're talking about. And I usually, when these people talk, I tend to keep my mouth shut a little bit. But I think I think there are a lot of people that will just say things, and if you have any level of knowledge of how wine works, you know that what they're saying just isn't true. And I think part of the problem is this is where some of the statements that we made right off the top of this podcast come about. People just think such and such is the way, and they don't question why it is. They just say, right, these are just flags that I can stick to. I saw it in a James Bond movie. He knew the guy wasn't British because he ordered red wine with his fish. Therefore, no one should ever do that.
But, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and that's true anywhere. And you see it a lot in wine. And one of I quote a lot, and there's an Oscar Wilde quote where he says, most people aren't themselves, they're other people. They're kind of a collection of quotes and things. The quote I'll use now is Einstein, and he said, any fool can know, the trick is to understand. And that's something that's geared everything I do. I don't just want to know things. I want to understand why they are. With those people who kind of promulgate these misunderstandings, I think that they're correct. I'm with you in that most of the time you kind of go, I'm not going to change this person's mind. Am I going to achieve anything by saying, actually, I think you'll find? Probably not. But it's figuring out who you can sort of gently inform and maybe correct when necessary. That other thing about arrogance, I see this, somebody's gone out and done a level 1 WSET, and that's great. People wanting to learn about wine at any level is brilliant. But somebody, goes, oh, I can talk about wine. I fancy this. They do a level 1 and they've kind of drunk a few wines for 6 months, and then they take to social media and go, I'm a wine expert. There are very few people can label themselves as experts. I've been doing this for 22 years. I'm nowhere near an expert. I've been very lucky to get to know various masters of wine. I've never heard a master of wine introduce himself as an expert in anything.
I think maybe with the Master of Wine, the amount of punishment that you have to go through and the amount of self-confidence that doing anything like that strips away. I don't think anyone after going through that sort of experience would have any sense of arrogance left, to be honest. I mean, and if they do, fair play, you're probably a sociopath.
I mean, I know a couple of MWs who've done it as quickly as it's possible to do it. They've done that. They are the most humble, down-to-earth people you could, and that's an accessibility and inclusion thing, which is really, really important. But a bit of humility doesn't go amiss, does it? Especially in wine.
Absolutely, and I'm someone who at times does need to be taken down a peg or two. So I would possibly say that the wine industry is very good for me personally. Heaven forbid I make a couple of correct calls on blind tasting, because I do tend to get that little bit smugger. But the thing is, it's not a problem, because I know that the next one I'm going to get absolutely trashed, and it will be the wine that I've had 6 times in the last 2 months and think I know it back to front, and it's a Riesling and I'm calling it Chardonnay or Muscat or something like that. So it's I mean, it's the great redeemer, right?
Oh, it definitely is. It's great for just making you realise you've always got an extra place to go, and there's always something new out there. Yeah, it's very much the great level.
And then by the same token, I mean, I think we'd probably both agree, if we're talking about these sort of myths and legends of the wine industry, going back to that, I do think there are some assumptions that people make that can be pretty spot on. I don't know if you agree with me on this.
Yeah, I do. I do. The thing I hear a lot is, when I tell people I work in wine or I'm a wine trade professional, generally the first thing I hear is, oh, wow, you must have so much fun. You must really enjoy what you do. Yeah, that's why we're not in this for the money or the hours, right? We love what we do, and that's why we get into it. And I think within that, most people seem to realise that, firstly, you're always learning. So even if they don't see what we do as being like a serious profession, I think most people go, wow, you must have to really keep on top of this. Because even, if I'm in the plate, that consumer might go, look, I buy all my wine from the supermarket. And even there, I realise that there's change. And, when I look at these shelves and there's so many different things, you must be constantly kind of learning and having to keep on top of it. They all, people realise that wine changes year to year. It's not consistent. It's like buying a can of Coke. They know that, oh, well, you can only make wine once a year. They kind of get that. So you're always learning. And I think consumers realise as well that this is a lifestyle choice. You choose to do this because of what it brings you, rather than you kind of chasing the dollar, or you want to be able to do something kind of in that area. And that's a hill I would die on. Anybody that says, I'd like to get into the wine industry, I go, is this your lifestyle? Those of us that do this properly do it because we really, really care about it.
What are some of the things that still surprise you about working in the wine industry?
There's a lot of things, actually. One of the things, and this is, I suppose I mentioned sort of accessibility. I think there's still a lack of diversity, and I wouldn't necessarily say inclusion, because certainly in the last few years, it feels to me like the trade is working really hard to be inclusive, to make sure those doors are open, to those of different backgrounds that traditionally we haven't seen in the industry. It's better than it's ever been, but there's still a long way to go. So I often do find that lack of diversity currently quite surprising. But then, as with everything, you drill down a little bit and you start to see that diversity is there, and there are great programs that are being run to promote people of different ethnic backgrounds, women, people of all sorts of different kind of backgrounds, races, creeds. And that's fantastic, because wine should be utterly inclusive. It's an agricultural product, and we turn it into this really wonderful liquid. I'm surprised in some ways that there still seems to be a barrier, I think, between what I would term everyday wine drinkers. So, there's, I think the current stats, so there's about 28 million wine drinkers in the UK. Wine is our favourite alcoholic beverage. There still seems to be a barrier between those everyday drinkers and the trade, those of us who really, really care about it. Now, somebody might be working in a different industry that's on a similar sort of artistic, expressive level and feel the same. I don't know anything about other industries. But I sometimes think that barrier there is actually widening because of technology. I don't think it's shortening. So, when I started running wine shops, a consumer had to come in and talk to me. Whereas now, everybody's got a phone in their pocket and they've got access to various different apps that have scores and reviews and things like that. And that goes back to the any fool can know. The trick is to understand. And that can potentially widen the distance between us. The trade's working harder. I think we've got brilliant communicators in this industry and they're reaching out. But, doing our best to kind of engage wine consumers of all levels, as long as we do it on the understanding that not everybody wants engaged. So a lot of what I do is based on, I've got information that might be useful to you. If you want it, I'm right here. What I'm not going to do is just stand and lecture you and go, you should do this and that and the other. No, you shouldn't. You should do what you're happy with, what you're comfortable with. If you want to explore, there's so many options. I'm someone you can talk to. There's 100 other people that you should seek out. But on that, don't just approach someone who's just walked into this and think they're an expert, as we talked about earlier. But I'm also surprised at our over-reliance on tasting notes. Now, what we're trying to do is communicate what something tastes like, and we have to do that through the medium of tasting notes. And I'm not anti-tasting notes. I think they're really powerful things. But there's a Wittgensteinian idea that the limits of my language, the limits of my world. And I find this, I talk to a lot of everyday wine drinkers, and I always ask them the question, and I use this term specifically. I go, right, just quick show of hands. Who's heard the wine term body? Every single hand goes up. And I go, right, I need you to be absolutely honest. How many of you know exactly what I'm talking about? And if there's a room of 50 people, maybe one hand stays up, but it's a little bit sort of, I think I'm not sure. Right, we use this term with abandon. We've not really explained it to consumers what it means. Certainly new consumers, okay, people who are, my age or older and watch Julie Gould and Oz Clarke probably have an idea. But we've never actually explained it. I had a great candidate. I was teaching abroad, and he said, I've got a question for you. He said, we were talking about the dryness of wine. What do we mean when we say a wine is dry? And this lad, he was brilliant. He said, I don't understand how a wine can be dry because it's liquid. And the opposite of wet is dry and liquid is wet. Like, what are you talking about? I go, brilliant. These are the questions we need you to ask, because if we're not sharing a common language, tasting note falls down. And I think as a trade, we need to talk more about emotion and feeling, and just keep the flavour profiles just a little bit less in the mix generally. All of that sounds quite negative, doesn't it? But what am I still surprised about by this industry? Everybody I meet in this industry is I'm consistently surprised at how kind people are, how generous they are, how creative and thoughtful. And so many people in this industry, you look at them and you go, you could go off into something like tech and make loads of money, or you could go into medicine and probably cause huge advancement. But people that just have such care and such love. And we live in an increasingly isolated world, sadly, where people are sort of moving away from each other. There's a lot of division. Wine is this thing that just everybody coming together. I'm surprised by that in a sense of wonder and awe, and I think it's wonderful. And despite what I said about consumer knowledge and the widening gap, I'm also surprised about the numbers of wine consumers that are actively seeking more knowledge and information. I taught some WSET at the weekend. I had a full class, and every single one of them was an interested consumer. There wasn't a single member of that class that was from the trade, and that's wonderful. People are engaged with wine, and there are people that want to learn about it. And as long as they know where we are when they want to, that's brilliant. It's just a fabulous industry. It's so wonderous.
On the subject of tasting notes, I think it's really, really interesting that you bring that up, particularly in terms of the language. Something I found really, really interesting when I was listening to, I think it was the Guild Song podcast. It was an Asian sommelier working through their qualifications in the United States. And they describe how when they described a wine for an examiner, they would first have to think what tasting note they would put in their head based on their experience. And their experience was of Asian flavors. So umami, soy, yuzu. She would then translate that to a Western audience in her head before she would then give her answer in the exam. So yuzu would translate into grapefruit pith or grapefruit peel. Umami would translate into vine tomatoes, that kind of thing. And I think it goes back to your point on tasting notes. It's such a personal thing. And I think maybe even with the WSET, I understand why we kind of have to have them. But sometimes I look at it and go, what is the point? Because it's such a subjective subject that we're now having to put into an objective framework.
It is fascinating, and it is ultimately subjective. I think when you're teaching the things like acid and alcohol and sugar, they're measurable, they're physical components in the wine, and we prove that by making acid samples and sugar samples. What you can't do with tasting is that, and I know you get these products and it's little pots of smell. I find that a little bit I find it deterministically reductive, because when you smell a wine, you don't smell each thing individually. You don't just go, oh, well, there's raspberries and there's cloves. You're smelling it all at once. So I get the idea behind those little pots of smell, but I don't think it's the easiest way to do it. That idea of kind of having a framework that everybody can move around, I think, is good. But what you can't do, so sometimes it's like, I suppose it's a little bit synesthesia, but when I taste, I kind of have things in different areas. And you'll see it when I talk about a wine, and I've got like fruit is up here to my top right and oats kind of down by my left leg, and I'm kind of doing it that way. But you can't do that in real life. You can't go, oh, I said there's raspberries, right? Let me put the wine in my hand or in the glass and pull it out for you. But we certainly do have a very anglicised language. I mean, I used to teach out in the Caribbean, and I would hear the term breadfruit an awful lot, and I had to go, I'm going to take your word for it. I don't know. I've not eaten one. And then the students pointed out, what's growing on that tree outside the window? Go and try it. I think they're important because wine is a flavour delivery mechanism, but we need to be looser around it. Certainly with everyday drinkers, not in education. But the Asian sommelier you talked about there, that's awful. I mean, wine's complicated enough, and exams are hard enough without having to think it, translate it, rephrase. That's beyond. That's further than it needs to go.
The level of admiration I have for people who are on my diploma course at the moment who are doing it in the second or third language, it's just unbelievable. It's insane how they're able to do
phenomenal.
it, sit in exams, compose their thoughts. I mean, I fall to pieces in these situations, and they're there doing it in an unfamiliar language. It's insane to me.
Absolutely incredible. I mean, to be able to speak a second language at all is incredible, but to do examination in that second language is to be hugely admired, massively so.
But there you go. And then one more thing on tasting notes, just because it makes me giggle every time. And I think my colleagues of the SET diploma course are sick of it by now. But every time I take tertiary notes, I always say, well, if you can smell mushroom, you can smell forest floor. And if you can smell forest floor, you can smell wet leaves. And if you can smell wet leaves, you can smell dirt. And there you've just pulled out a hell of a lot of different tasting notes, right? So let's go back, let's wrap it up, and let's talk a little bit about these 10 questions that we addressed right at the beginning of the podcast. The older the wine is, the better it is. What do we have to say about that?
So, some wines should age, others shouldn't. So it's a very, obviously, broad brushstroke comment. You know, if you're thinking very high quality Barolo or Bordeaux or Rhone, often the older, the better. However, if you're an Italian Pinot Grigio drinker, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, I've got this wine and it's 10 years old. It's not going to be in good state, generally speaking. There's a couple of New Zealand Sauvignons do age quite well. The biggest thing I take from that is better. The way consumers understand the word better, they understand it to mean, I will enjoy it more. Not necessarily. If your bag is like 10 quid Aussie Shiraz, that's great. Don't go buying this 30-year-old claret, because the thing that you find pleasure in, the wine isn't going to do that.
And yeah, some of the best wines are wines that have been built to last no more than 2 years. And I've made the mistake where I've kept those wines in my fridge because I know they're delicious and I'm waiting for a special occasion to open them. And by the time that occasion comes around, the wine is dead. So number 2, the more expensive a wine is, the better it is.
So again, we've got this term better, which, you know, to a consumer, does it mean they will like it more than another wine? Not necessarily. However, the more expensive the wine generally means better quality fruit, better quality winemaking, better ingredients. We can apply that in other things, food, clothing. If you want something that's good quality, you have to pay for it. And generally, I think the more you spend on a wine, you get a series of processes that have led to the creation of that wine that are just better than a wine that is cheaper. Again, if you like drinking 10 quid Aussie Shiraz, is a £50 bottle of claret a better wine? Yeah, it's more complex, it's more interesting. Doesn't mean you'll enjoy it more as a consumer, but the wine is better. And that is a fact.
I mean, and by the same kind of token, you get a lot of people coming around and saying, you're just paying for marketing here. This is point number 3. We're moving on. Anyway, you're just paying for marketing here. There is no difference between this wine. Or, which I prefer, they're coming and asking, why does this wine cost £10 versus this wine that costs £20? And it is a tricky thing to explain.
When customers ask it that way, you know, not is this one better than that one, but well, why is this one twice the price? Because again, there's something tangible that you can explain, and you can explain in sort of simple and accessible ways. So I like that approach. I do think there's a law of diminishing returns. And, you know, I know the question you asked was above a certain price, are you just paying for marketing? I don't think it's necessarily just marketing, but certainly above a certain price point, you're not inherently paying for the quality of the wine as such. You're paying. Let's look at DRC, Domaine de la Romanée Conti, one of the most expensive wines on the planet, thousands of pounds a bottle, right? Is that wine as good as a wine can be? I have to actually, it's one of the top end wines I'm yet to taste, but I know people who've tried it and they said, you know, it's everything that you want a wine to be. But thousands of pounds a bottle, you're paying for history, you're paying for provenance, you're paying for rarity. You're not, you know, £6,000 bottle. There's bottles of wine at 60 quid that are outstanding and will give you so much pleasure. I would take your point of spending above something you're paying for marketing and other stuff, but I might notch that up a bit closer to 50 these days. Even 20 quid's a lot of money on a bottle of wine, given that the average spend in the UK is still only around 8 quid, and that's only gone up because duties risen at such a dramatically high rate.
I think it is tricky, right? Because you kind of have to look at every stage of how that wine's been made. And maybe I'm coming at it from a WSET perspective here, but when people ask me that question, I say, well, okay, well, let's start in the vineyard and let's say, wine A has been grown on a better site that has a better aspect. So it's seen more sunlight. It's been planted at a lower density. So there's fewer grapes, which means that those grapes are going to be more concentrated. They're going to be picked maybe slightly later, a little bit more flavor, versus wine B that has probably been harvested a little bit earlier because they just want a bit of phenolic ripeness, and they've gone, do you know what? If this wine doesn't taste quite right, we can rectify that in a big tank in the winery. And then you're talking about, okay, what else happens in that winery? Are they using these French oak barriques, which cost about €1,200 for something that they can only really use 3 or 4 times tops? Or are they going to be made in a ginormous vat with some oak chips stirred in for good measure, or heaven forbid some vanilla essence poured in as well? There's a big difference there. And then are they getting that wine out within about 2 weeks of it coming into the winery, so that means they can get a return on investment pretty much immediately? Or are they going to sit on that wine in a cold, dark cellar that they have to pay a mortgage on or a lot of rent on for years and years and years and years? That's why this wine costs this much and this wine costs this much. Does it make it a better wine? Maybe not, because if you're going to enjoy wine B more than wine A, then to you, wine B is a better wine. And guess what? You've saved yourself 15, 20, 30 quid. But yeah. I mean, this is probably one of the worst secrets of working in the wine industry, is the more that you learn about the wine, the more expensive your taste gets. So there you go.
Oh, definitely. I've got a champagne palate and a lemonade wallet. Actually, champagne's a really good case in point. I've been lucky to try, Solos and Krug and like really good examples of them as well. And then when I have a more everyday champagne, as much as I might enjoy it, I'm always going, oh, but that one's so much better. But I agree. Find the tangibles. So I don't know anything about cars, but I have a rough understanding of why an Aston Martin might cost more than an everyday Ford. As much as I don't necessarily understand the stuff behind it, I've got an idea of, well, this one's more technical, it's got more work on it, and it's faster. It's got measurables, and we've got to find that in the wine, because that at least helps frame it. When I teach, I focus on this a lot. I'll do wine side by side, and I go, right, I'll do them blind. So I spend a lot of time talking about tasting and what we're trying to understand, and I get to a point in the course and I go, right, I'm going to present you 2 wines blind. I just want you to taste them accurately, and we'll talk about them. And then I'll get them to write the tasting notes, and we go through them, and then I say, right, which one of these wines is better? And one will be a really massive brand that sells millions of cases, and one will be very, very small scale, at least 3-4 times the price, minimum, often more. And go, which one of these is better? And it's getting candidates to go, I get that the second wine is better. Right, I understand why, because it's more complex, more interesting, blah, blah, blah. And I go, which one do you like more? Because that's a totally different question. So it's kind of getting people to understand this is better, but doesn't mean you like it more. And I really enjoy playing around with that dynamic with any tasting group. It's really interesting to do.
I mean, that's the argument for the Judgment of Paris, right? They took these old school Bordeaux brands that everybody just assumed were the best wines in the world, put them up against these lovely, rich, full-flavoured, fruity California wines, and they said, right, do this blind where you don't know what you're going to do. Of course the California ones are going to do well because they're just so delicious, essentially, and you don't have to think about it.
More accessible. Yeah, exactly.
All right, so number 4, wine sealed with a cork are better quality than wine sealed with a screw cap.
This is as a winemaker, what do you want the wine to do? Do you want the wine to be drunk within a couple of years or so, stay really fresh, pure, clean, bright? Screw cap's great. Do you want your wine to age, develop, change in the bottle? Cork is the best thing for that. There's a lot of research being done about corks that will slowly let a bit of air in, but effectively it's an oxygen barrier, right? So too much oxygen kills the wine, a little bit of oxygen allows the wine to develop. Ultimately, I don't think one is necessarily better or worse. It's just what you want it to do. So when I started in this racket, this was a really common question from consumers. Today, it's less common. I still hear it, but I don't hear it anywhere near as commonly. Those hang-ups don't exist in the same way that they did, 2 decades ago. I think we've also got to take into account that 95% of wine bought in the UK is consumed within 24 hours of purchase. But, there are not that many people actually buy wine to lay it down, to age it, to improve it, or to sell on as investment. Screw cap's great, removes the need for a corkscrew. You're into it immediately. It's easy to reseal rather than fighting with it, getting a cork back in the bottle. But for those producers and those drinkers who want wines that will change and improve and age, cork is great. It's all about what you want to do.
Fantastic. Number 5, wines made with no added sulfur won't give you a hangover.
This is a real bugbear of mine, because it comes back to that knowing and understanding. When it's a slow news day, which actually there aren't a lot of those these days, but the mass media will peddle out this thing and go, "Oh, sulfites are bad for you," and if you don't have sulfites, you won't get a hangover. Right? What gives you a hangover is alcohol. Right, done. So it's the same thing with organic. Oh, I drink organic wine, it doesn't give me a hangover. Okay, now, without getting into the technicalities and the nuance, organic wine might have fewer components that maybe really big brand mass market stuff might have that could be an allergen, right? But it's not as simple as that makes it sound, and we haven't got time to go into that. What gives you a hangover is alcohol. If your organic wine is not giving you a hangover, you're not drinking enough of it, essentially. That's not a bad thing, because hangovers are awful. Sulfites, anybody that... So what I would do when I was in retail, obviously I'm not in a shop these days, but a customer might come in and say, "Oh, I want a wine with no added sulfites." I would ask them why, and try to understand why they want this. And ultimately it would come down to say that, well, I've read a headline in a particular newspaper, and depending on that newspaper, I'd either boot them out or interact with them. So you go, okay, so you've read this headline, okay, but what is your actual understanding of this? And then I would, as best as I could, within a minute, because they don't want to lecture, I would explain why it's not actually relevant. And of course, I would default to the same thing that all of us in wine do and go, well, do you eat dried fruit? Do you eat bacon? Because they've got a lot more sulfites in them than wine. If you're getting hangovers and allergic response, it's probably not the sulfites. And the other thing is that sulfites, they are an allergen, but what they don't do is give you a headache, right? That's not what sulfites would do if it's an allergen. What they do is they'd leave you feeling queasy, nauseous, kind of a bit sweaty, a bit prickly throat. Much like if you've come to my stand-up comedy and you're in the audience, that's how you generally feel. It's an allergic reaction, like hay fever is a reaction to pollen. It's not giving you the hangover. So whilst there can be things to think about with sulfite, it's not hangovers.
Why do you think there is such a stigma on sulfites? It's such a strange thing for people to pick out.
I'm going to relate this to alcohol as well. So sulfites and alcohol, and this is just my, I suppose, my hypothesis. A lot of wine drinkers out there, as we've been talking about myths, a lot of wine drinkers still go, wine's really mysterious and weird, and I don't understand it, and therefore as a consumer I feel really powerless and unsure when I'm going into a wine shop or a supermarket and I'm confronted with this wall of stuff I don't understand. And what we want to do as people is we want to find something we can hang on to that gives us a little bit of confidence. And I think that the story about sulfites has been peddled for so long that consumers can go, all right, well, I've read this more than once. It must be true. That this is going to give me something that I can hang on to, so I don't just feel silly and like I don't know anything. So maybe that will either make me more secure, or maybe it will give me some kind of connection with the person talking to me about the wine. So that's not a bad reason for doing it. And we all want consumers to feel more confident based on understanding rather than knowing, from my opinion.
So here's one that was probably one of the first bits of wine snobbery that I ever heard when I was about 18 years old. When you swirl wine in a glass, the legs or the tears that run down the inside of the glass have a bearing on the quality of the wine.
So I labour under this concept that we use the term gatekeepers today, right? I labour under this concept that for a long time there were people who knew quite a lot about wine and they were a little bit protective of it. They didn't want to let people in. So that people didn't realise that actually most of our time is just spent humping boxes around and with heads in books. They wanted to maintain this mystery. And what we wanted to do, so again, we wanted to kind of arm the consumer in some way, but not tell them too much, not give the secrets away. So somewhere in the midst of time, somebody's gone, oh no, consumers are asking us stuff again. Well, just tell them legs. Tell them to swirl the glass and legs are there. I get asked this one a lot. An awful lot, whether it's in WSET courses or the consumer-focused events I run. Guarantee it's going to come up every session. Well, what about these things called legs? I go, okay, so you've heard of them, yeah? Any idea what it means? No, just somebody told me it meant the wine was better. Like, it doesn't. Legs, when you see them, the legs in the glass of wine could be there for a variety of different reasons. Could be alcohol, could be sugar, could be glycerol. The legs themselves don't tell you why they're there. Right, it's not like, well, legs because of alcohol have a particular shape and legs because of sugar have a different shape. We don't know. What will happen is when you smell the wine and taste it, you'll figure out if it's good or not, or if it's better. So I had this thing go, can we just stop talking about legs now?
I mean, it's a nice, easy way to explain something away, isn't it? Why do all of these wine dickheads swirl their glasses every time they get poured a glass? I mean, you could explain all of the stuff about oxygenation, yada, yada, yada. Or you could just say, well, the things that run down the side of the glass, that means it's good. Life is a lot easier when things are black and white, right? I mean, it's the same thing with, how do I know a bottle of wine is really good when I know nothing about wine? Well, how big is the punt of that bottle?
Oh.
Because if you've got a really big punt, the wine must be really, really good. And sure, fine, no worries. Look,
yeah, totally. A lot of it came from laser. That's a good one. I get that a lot still. Also, is the heavier the bottle, does that mean the wine's better? No, it doesn't, and it's worse for the environment. So sort it out. And I am looking at you, Argentina, because you've been really guilty of that. Massive bottles. Also, Southern Italy. Seriously, sort it out.
Number 7, red wine is best served at room temperature.
Well, firstly, you go, well, what is room temperature? Room temperature 300 years ago, when this thing started being discussed, was very different to room temperature now. Also, there's a lot of red wines benefit from being slightly chilled. Beaujolais is the really famous one. There are many, many other examples, and some wines benefit. We generally, as a rule, and I know this has done the rounds for a few years now, but we generally drink white wines too cold and red wines too warm. So I think it was Peter Richards, MW, that I first saw or heard really talking about the idea of, take your white wine out of the fridge 20 minutes before you drink it, put your red wine in the fridge 20 minutes before you drink it. The main thing here for me is, how do you like to drink your wine? Do you like to drink it warm, cold? You pay your money, you take your choice. I could explain to you why maybe certain wines would have an optimum serving temperature, but if that's not how you enjoy your wine, it's largely irrelevant. But yeah, like the temperature of my front room is very different depending on whether my wife is in it or whether I am in it. So that alone proves it's actually quite an unhelpful phrase.
And here's an interesting one. The second cheapest bottle on a restaurant wine list usually has the biggest markup.
So I think I said agree to this, broadly speaking. So I for the last few years, I've been doing pieces of work with bars, restaurants, hotel, wine vendors all over the UK. I've got Scotland, and really far north Scotland, basically the Arctic Circle, 3 or 4 times a year. I'd be down in Cornwall. This comes from the idea that when people were ordering wine off a wine menu, they didn't want to order the cheapest because they didn't like the image that necessarily they felt it portrayed. Nor did they want to buy the most expensive because maybe they didn't know the wine and they couldn't afford it. So the idea was, well, if I buy the second most expensive, I don't look like somebody who can't afford it, and I don't I don't look like someone who doesn't want to spend money, and I don't look like someone who doesn't know what they're doing. So I'll buy the second, and that's kind of promulgated for such a long time. A lot of the operators that I've worked with, and I've worked with small, independent restaurants, I've worked with national chain, kind of still cling on to that idea of, well, let's just notch up the markup on the second wine. So I think by and large that's true. I think, however, that's going to change. I think operators are now starting to be more imaginative and actually think about their consumer base and what they want, rather than just applying this kind of blanket rule. One of the things I've seen change on lists, and I don't think for the better, is the concept of house wine. So we now see the term house wine as meaning the cheapest wine. That was never the case. House wine was the wine that the operator of that venue at the end of the shift would drink because they liked it the most, and it kind of represented maybe the best value. And we have this idea in the UK, particularly, that value means cheap. But yeah, I think it will start changing eventually.
As someone who worked in hospitality for 18 years, it seems like a strange concept to me, and something that I never really thought of. We just get told to hit the margin that we have to hit. And I think most operators, particularly if you're a general manager and you're not an owner, you're going to go, well, I have it in my job description that I have to hit a 70% margin, a 75% margin, or something like that. Here's this wine. This is how much it costs. This is what I have to put it on the menu at in order to achieve that margin. Happy days. So maybe there are general managers out there, and there's no ifs, buts, and maybes about it. There are people out there who are better at hospitality than I am. But in my general experience, I never came across an operator that said, here's what you've got to do, right? It's the oldest trick in the book. You make the second wine a little bit more of a it's so maybe it does happen, but I certainly never experienced it, having worked in many venues.
It's definitely changed. I also think operators now, the amount of operators I've worked with, where it's like, margin has to be this. Like, no. Let's think about the cash, because you need cash for your business to exist. So let's work out decent cash margins. So you've got money in your hand. Margin is a percentage, is a tool to kind of visualize how well your business is doing overall. Let's strip that out and talk about putting really good wines on lists and how you're going to sell them and make some cash off it. So yeah, it's good to see that approach starting to come.
We've already talked a little bit about never drinking red wine with fish, so I think we can probably move on from that one. So finally, number 10, you should never, ever, ever drink Chardonnay.
So I joined this game just at the start of the kind of tail off popularity of Chardonnay, and it's, you know, we've ended up in that ABC thing and anything but Chardonnay. What I'm seeing is people slowly come back round to it, but I think there's a really important point here. So when I started doing this, it was an inside joke in the trade that we'd have customers coming into wine shops going, "Oh, I don't like Chardonnay, but I like Chablis," and we'd all have a jolly good laugh at it. And then I started to go, well, hang on a minute. Well, whilst that's funny because we know it's funny, it's not funny for the consumer, because we're not really helping them. We're laughing at them. That's not a good look for anybody. It's not really going to help our industry. It's not inclusive. It's not accessible. But the fact is, we still joke about it. And you can argue that consumers don't always listen. That's very true. But if in 20 years we've not solved that problem, we're not doing a good enough job to really communicate this. And there's lots of people who've been communicating that it's not Chardonnay that's the problem, it's the way the wine's made. We're not getting the message out clearly. Look, there's a lot of Chardonnay out there that's just all right, but you could say that for any grape variety. There's a lot of examples of them that's just all right. The world's best Chardonnays are some of the best white wines you will ever try. And you know what? Just because you've had a bad example of something, try another one. And then try that. There's a law of diminishing. If you've tried 100 Chardonnays and you didn't like them, don't drink Chardonnay. But some of the best wines on this planet are made from a really much maligned grape variety, rather unfairly.
Absolutely. And it's the case of, if you drink enough of something, you're going to find a bad one. It's just the law of averages. I like going back to the car analogy, because I think cars are something tangible that we can look at, and you mentioned it earlier, and I'm glad that I'm not the only one that does it. But I always say you wouldn't refuse to drive a Ferrari if you said, well, I had this banged up 1980s Fiat once and it drove terribly, therefore I'm never going to drive another Italian car.
That's a really great analogy. You know, and also things change. This idea, I talk about this a lot with German wine. I adore German wine. I think it's a great country with a wonderful culture, and the wines are incredible. Still, nigh on 40 years later, people still going, "Oh, Liebfraumilch's Blue Onion." Like, it was 40 years ago. Get over it. Come on. And that's part, it's part of the fun of what we do. Is just say changing hearts and minds feels like hyperbole, but trying to take consumers. I know you think you don't like this. Let's work with it, and I think I'll find one that you do like.
So Lee, just to wrap up, final question for you. Hopefully, we may have inspired one or two people to come and join us on this wine industry bandwagon. What advice would you give anyone out there who would like to get involved in the wine industry and maybe isn't too sure where to start?
The way I started was I found a job in a wine shop. And I, to this day, wherever you want to go, it's different. If you know you want to be a winemaker, then go to Plumpton, learn your trade, work with others, get some experience. If you want to break into the world of wine as a whole, maybe you want to go into sales, marketing, advertising, wholesaling, whatever, start in an independent wine shop, because what you will learn in there, you can't learn from a book or on an official wine course. You learn lots of things those ways. But working in a wine shop, you learn about so many different products and regions and areas very, very quickly, because you have to. You also learn what people want, what they know, and how to talk to them. And I think that to be the best wine merchant you can be, you have to know how to talk to people about it. And you learn that working in a wine shop. Ask questions, approach others. Most, as I've said, most wine professionals are happy to talk about what we do and talk about product. Drop me a message on the social medias. There are other people I can't obviously offer their time, but most of us, if they got a message from you, I'm going to talk to you. Keep learning, keep tasting, keep just trying to pick up nuggets as you go. And remember that knowledge should not be a barrier. So when I got into the trade, I didn't know anything about wine. I was 8. I didn't know it, but I had the right attitude and I had the enthusiasm, and I clearly showed that I want to do this. And if you can display that, you'll definitely get a shot. Learn as much as you can, talk to other people, get to events, get to tastings, get your face out there. And if you can start in a shop, I know I said indies, that's because where my heart really lies. The big national retailer is out there. Maybe they would have vacancies. Get yourself into a wine shop, because you'll learn huge amounts that you will always carry with you, whether you go into education, marketing, coffee, whatever. Also, do it. It's a great industry. Don't come in with expectations of earning loads of money, consistently travelling around the world, and always eating Michelin-star food. Sometimes those things happen, and it's brilliant. But it's a lifestyle choice, and if you want that as your lifestyle, if I can help, if you as I said, contact me on social medias for advice or thoughts, I'd be very happy to. Come and join us. This is a fabulous industry, it really is.
Just do it.
Just do it.
Lee Isaacs, thank you so much for your time, your insight, your knowledge. That was absolutely fantastic. And hopefully we can get you back on to do an Argentina one as well.
I would be delighted. I'm always amazed that people would ask me to do anything, but to be asked to be a guest on a podcast is, what a wonderful thing to say to someone. Like we want to hear what you think and what you have to say. So, I'm very lucky, unduly so. I'm very privileged that I do this for a living, and to be a guest on here is equally wonderful. So thank you for having me. Cheers.
Cheers.